Imagine coming home after work, eating dinner, and turning on the television. There is no streaming service, no remote control with hundreds of channels, no pause button, no recommendation algorithm. And depending on where you live, you may have only 2 television channels to choose from. This was television in the Soviet Union. Let us imagine an ordinary Soviet family living in an apartment in 1985, where television sits in the most important corner of the living room. It is large, heavy, and covered in fake wood or hard plastic. The screen is much smaller than the television itself. The picture occasionally shakes. The sound sometimes crackles, and when someone wants to change the channel, they must stand up, walk across the room, and turn a physical dial. This means the youngest person in the family has already become the remote control. By the 1980s, television was available to most of the Soviet population. It was no longer a rare luxury owned only by wealthy or important families. But a good television was still expensive enough to be treated carefully. The family did not replace it every few years. If it stopped working, they called a repairman. If the repairman could not find the correct part, he found a similar part. If that did not work, a neighbor might know somebody who could make it work. The goal was not to buy a newer television. The goal was to prevent this television from dying. Now the family turns it on. Nothing happens, they wait. Older television sets used vacuum tubes, so the picture could take time to appear. First comes a small glowing dot, then a bright line. Finally, the screen slowly comes to life. Doc says. The Soviet Union had several official television programs, which were similar to channels. But most viewers did not receive all of them. People in major cities, such as Moscow and Leningrad, usually had more choices. Families in smaller cities or remote regions might receive only the main national channel and perhaps one regional channel. There was no endless channel surfing. If nothing interesting was showing, you had 3 options. Watch it anyway, turn off the television, or stare at another family member until somebody started a conversation. Much of Soviet television was organized around a fixed schedule. Children's programs appeared at certain times. News arrived at certain times. Films, concerts, educational programs, sporting events, and political broadcasts were planned in advance. If you missed a show, you could not watch it tomorrow on demand. You could only hope it was broadcast again. This made popular programs into shared national events. Millions of people watched the same show at approximately the same time. The next morning, children discussed the same cartoon. Adults discussed the same film. Coworkers repeated the same jokes. Television offered less choice, but the programs that succeeded could become deeply rooted in Soviet culture. Children might watch animated programs such as Nu, Pogodi. The cartoon followed a badly behaved wolf chasing a clever hare. The story did not require complicated dialogue. The wolf made plans. The plans failed. The hare escaped. And Soviet children were satisfied. There were also educational shows, puppet programs, nature documentaries, and performances designed for young viewers. Some children waited all day for a cartoon that lasted only 10 minutes. Modern children may find this difficult to understand, but when entertainment is limited, 10 minutes can become an important appointment. Adults could watch theater, ballet, classical music, comedy, sports, documentaries, and Soviet films. Foreign programs occasionally appeared, but they were carefully selected. The average viewer did not freely browse American sitcoms, British dramas, and foreign news. Imported entertainment had to be considered acceptable by the authorities. Even when a foreign movie was shown, it might be edited or dubbed into Russian. One voice could sometimes speak for several different characters. A dramatic American hero might sound suspiciously similar to his girlfriend, his enemy, and the local police officer. But the most important program of the evening was the news. At 9 o'clock Moscow time, millions watched Vremya. The name meant time. Vremya reported official news from across the Soviet Union and the world. Viewers saw government meetings, factory production, agricultural achievements, visiting foreign leaders, military ceremonies, and reports about Soviet progress. The presentation was serious, the announcers were formal, there was very little improvisation. And nothing important appeared on television without government approval. Soviet television was owned and controlled by the state. There were no competing private news networks openly criticizing the Communist Party. A factory might miss its production target, a region might face food shortages. A political decision might be unpopular, but the evening news usually presented the country as stable, productive, and moving successfully toward a better future. Problems in capitalist countries received different treatment. If unemployment increased in the United States, Soviet viewers might hear about it. If workers protested in Western Europe, cameras were interested. If a Soviet store had no sausage, the evening news was less curious. This did not mean viewers believed everything they saw. Soviet citizens could recognize the gap between television and their own lives. A news report might announce another successful harvest. Then a viewer would visit the grocery store and discover very little food. The television said production was increasing. The empty shelf offered an alternative report. Still, Soviet television was not 5 straight hours of propaganda. Some of its films, comedies, cartoons, concerts, and dramas were genuinely loved. Many programs were well written and carefully produced. People became attached to actors, presenters, and television traditions. A particularly important tradition arrived every New Year's Eve. Families gathered around the television to watch holiday entertainment, speeches, music, comedy, and familiar films. The television became part of the celebration, almost like another person sitting at the table. Color television had begun appearing in the Soviet Union in the late 1960s, but black and white sets remained common for years afterward. A color television was expensive and desirable. A family that purchased one might invite relatives or neighbors to see it. For the first few days, everyone stared at ordinary programs with new excitement. The news was still formal, the speeches were still long. But now the officials were in color. Reception could also be difficult. A family might adjust the antenna, move the television, hit the side of the cabinet, move the antenna again. Then one person would stand in an uncomfortable position beside the wall. Suddenly, the picture became perfect. Nobody knew why. The person was instructed not to move. By the late 1980s, television began to change. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, meaning greater openness. Programs started discussing problems that had previously received little public attention. Journalists became more direct. Political debates appeared. Previously hidden parts of Soviet history were discussed. Viewers who had spent decades watching carefully controlled broadcasts suddenly saw arguments, criticism, and uncertainty on the same television screen. The television was no longer simply telling citizens that everything was proceeding according to plan. Now it was showing them that the plan itself might be falling apart. So what was television like in the Soviet Union? It had few channels, the schedule was rigid, the equipment was bulky, the news was controlled by the government. But television was also a powerful shared experience. It entertained children. It brought films, sports, theater, and music into small apartments. It created national traditions. And every evening, millions of people watched the same screen together. Today, you can choose from more programs than one person could watch in a lifetime. The Soviet viewer had far fewer choices. But there was one advantage. They never spent 45 minutes scrolling through menus before deciding there was nothing to watch. Thanks for watching, comrades. If you enjoyed this look at everyday life in the Soviet Union, like the video and subscribe for more stories from behind the Iron Curtain. Until next time.